After the success of the first Dark the Lad game, it was no surprise that a sequel soon followed. Some even purported that the first game was merely a demo, testing the market waters to check the viability of the franchise on the PlayStation console. Japan loved it, lapping up the first title to the tune of 400,000 units, and more subsequent sales from a later re-release, and the other titles in the franchise that inevitably followed. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. This time, I would like to take a look at Arc the Lad 2, the sequel to Sony Computer Entertainment Japan's critically acclaimed bestseller, Arc the Lad. Released in Japan in 1996 for the original Sony PlayStation, Arc the Lad 2 directly follows the events of its predecessor. Set not long after the climax of the previous title, Arc and his gang are now wanted criminals for the murder of the King of Palencia, and Andal is moving forward with his plans to dominate the world using the stolen Ark. Sadly, Indiana Jones is nowhere to be seen, so I guess it's up to our new protagonist Elk to save the day. Elk is a hunter who has reoccurring nightmares of the destruction of his village by the Silver Noah from when he was a child. For this atrocious act of mass genocide, Elk has sworn vengeance against Ark and his companions, believing that they perpetrated the heinous act. Frankly, having been framed for killing the Palencian king, Ark doesn't really have any evidence to suggest otherwise, though we as the player know better, right? Elk possesses powers that all men from his village are blessed with, allowing him to easily conjure fire, a power that is heavily sought after by those in powerful places. Due to this, after the attack on his village, he was captured and detained as a child in a facility where disturbing experiments took place. We join Elk as he undertakes a mission to stop a terrorist that has shut down Proteus Airport. During the events of this undertaking, Elk stumbles upon a girl and a monster in the hold of an airship, however the monster doesn't attack him. Confused by this, he doesn't have time to contemplate it, as the terrorist is getting away. Confronting the terrorist on the airship's deck, he learns that a group called the Cabal are not ones to be messed with when they kill the terrorist right in front of him. They then set their sights on the girl and her monster companion, who had joined Elk to battle the threat to the citizens of Proteus. Doing what he thinks is right, Elk helps the girl, whose name is Lieza, and the monster to escape, earning the notice of the mayor of Proteus. This scenario sets the scene for the larger world stage, where Elk eventually discovers who really destroyed his village, and collects allies in order to prevent the end of the world as everyone knows it. Arc the Lad 2 sports most of its original cast, with the addition of a number of other characters that assist in various ways both in battle and in their professions. I should note that unfortunately Kukuru is not a party member due to story circumstances, and Chongara is also unable to be used, because he decided to take up smoking, and perhaps that affects his lungs. But seriously, he's now the captain of the Silver Noah, and a captain never leaves his ship. Tosh is still a powerhouse, and fortunately Poco actually became proficient in the use of the symbols. Not only has his damage output been improved, but he also is a pretty decent, if not the best, healer of the group. In addition to the story party members, because Lieza's a girl who can communicate with monsters, many different enemies can also be recruited into the party. It's gonna be a real hooch, believe me. The humour in Arc the Lad 2 is on par with that of its predecessor, and this was very much welcomed. The tone of this game is much darker and very gritty. I felt at times, in the early hours of the game, that I was a hard-boiled detective in a noir film, such as Double Indemnity or Sunset Boulevard, especially when you meet the femme fatale Shantae, and of course she sings in a dingy bar. The game doesn't throw its punches, with themes of the exploitation of children, genocide, and sacrifice, just to name a few, often appearing in the narrative. I was often shocked by what was shown on the screen rather than mentioned, like in other games of this genre. I understand that SCEJ wanted the player to despise the antagonists, but I wonder if some of it was a little too much. Particularly, one instance I can reference without spoiling the game is the firing squad scene in the beginning. Despite my reservations and how repulsed I felt by it, it was very effective at evoking the emotions that the game was trying to pull from me. It almost reminds me of Persona 3, in how in that game, school students emulate committing suicide with a gun in order to invoke their inner demon.
Persona.
Whilst that draws comparisons these days to gun crimes, the firing squad scene draws comparisons to real-life history, such as the assassination of the Romanov dynasty in the former Soviet Union. perhaps it's important that we understand that such reprehensible crimes exist in our history. For what is fiction without reality? The plot sees the party returning to many of the locations that appeared in the original game, with the addition of many more. Almost every location from the first game can be returned to, with some expanded upon, including towns, cities, and dungeons to explore. In fact, this game was around 3 times longer than the first game. If you are a fan of long RPGs, then maybe this one will be for you. There weren't many moments for me when the plot dragged, and I was always kept entertained by the antics of the various party members and how they interacted with each other. Particularly, if you recruit the 2 optional characters, I enjoyed how during crucial story moments, they also had little scenes amidst those of the rest of the party. Whilst the story of the game is very long, you don't need to feel like you must keep chipping away at it exclusively, as the game also includes side quests from hunters guilds across the world. Each guild has its own set of quests, and some of them must be done within a certain time frame, such as before disembarking to the next continent in the story. These side quests are optional, but often they have unique criteria to complete, and form some of the more interesting battles and scenes in the game. As most of these can be done at the player's own pace, barring those that close when you move on, it's easy to jump into them if you want to take a break from the story. I often found myself forgoing continuing the story in order to undertake these quests, because they enrich the world and its lore. For example, at one point you are tasked with locating a dog for a man. After you find it, and win a battle, you return to find that the owner is gone. Subsequently, because Elk is such a nice guy, he adopts the dog, and you can feed it treats in his apartment to teach it tricks. Sadly though, it cannot help you in battle like one trusty Angelo. Hunters Guilds also contain bounties, which are requests posted to kill certain unique monsters. Some of these monsters can be found when exploring the different areas of a region, and some will appear during story battles. Killing these unique enemies will usually give you a useful item, in addition to money and merits when you turn in the bounty at the Hunters Guild. Merits are important, as there are some items and one side quest you can only obtain if you have over 250 of them. Don't despair, however, as merits can come easily from completing both Hunters quests and by killing wanted monsters. I found that I had way over 250 merits by the end of my playthrough. Ark the Lad 2 plays similarly to that of its predecessor, with a few quality of life adjustments made. For starters, all areas can now be explored extensively by the party, rather than just selecting a location and going straight into battle. There are also dungeons that you can explore, progress the story, and find useful treasures in. Additionally, a menu with character statistics and the ability to equip weapons and items is accessible almost any time at the press of a button. This makes managing the larger party much easier than the first game. If you transferred data from the first Ark the Lad title, there are additional bonuses, such as characters from the first game retaining their levels, and the items you collected from the Forbidden Ruins being available midway into the game. If you recruited Choco, then you will also get additional story for her, if you choose to add her to your party. There's no reason not to, because she will wipe the floor with any adversary. Like the previous title, Ark the Lad 2 uses a turn-based strategy battle system, somewhat similar to Final Fantasy Tactics or Vandal Hearts. At the start of battle, you are asked to choose 5 characters from your party, who will then fight in the battle or explore the dungeon you have just entered. In the case of a dungeon, you must use those 5 characters for the entirety of the location, and cannot change them unless you leave and re-enter, in which case the enemies will respawn. When you encounter a battle, your 5 characters will take fixed positions on the battlefield. In some instances, this can be disadvantageous, sometimes leaving weaker characters exposed to the brunt of the enemy's attacks. Additionally, a few of the locations have long, tight corridors, making battle a lot more difficult. This is something that wasn't fixed from the first game, and needlessly draws out the length of some battles. Upon a character's turn, they can move around the field within their movement range, indicated in blue, and then attack, use abilities, or use items. Characters may also jump over other characters or enemies if they have the jump skill, and can also sometimes catch objects that are thrown at them if they have the catch skill. Rather than a radial menu for abilities, and a separate menu for items, both functions have been merged into a simpler list. By having everything simplified like this, it's easier to choose items or abilities, or even check the party status on the fly. Characters will gain experience from almost every action that they take in battle, like in the first game, and certain actions have greater experience values than others. For example, killing an enemy will grant the most experience, whereas healing grants a lower amount. Experience is based on the character's level comparative to that of the enemy. so if your character's level is a lot lower than that of the enemies, they will level up quickly, and slower if they are a higher level. Characters may also level up their abilities and their skill with using weapons. Each character has certain weapons that they are proficient with, and some weapons have different attack ranges. For example, Elk can use a sword, spear, or axe. A sword is a normal 1 square weapon, whereas a spear can attack 2 squares away, and an axe can only attack 1 square, but is much stronger than the sword at the cost of accuracy. Choosing the best combination of party members and their weapons is the key to whether you'll have an easy or difficult time within dungeons. I complained in my previous review that there were no ranged weapons, so I'm glad to see that this time around that has been fixed. One complaint that I do still have about the battle system, though a minor gripe, is with the use of abilities. I didn't mention this in my previous review, but an ability can only be cast directly upon a person or monster and not the ground. So for example, if you want to cast a spell on a group of enemies, or heal all your party members with one spell, they must be in the correct formation for everyone to be targeted. As you cannot target the ground, it adds a little bit more of a challenge to the game, and makes some battles longer than they need to be. The other thing that I should mention is that whilst the enemies are generally equal to, or only a little higher in level than that of your party in the beginning of the game, toward the end it's easy to find yourself some 30 levels behind that of the enemies. In my playthrough, this wasn't for want of grinding or doing side quests, as I tended to do everything I could before moving on. Due to the huge discrepancy in levels between your party and the enemies at the end of the game, it becomes necessary to grind to even stand a chance in the last couple of dungeons, and against the final boss. This is a complaint that I frequently came upon when I was looking up information about the game after I beat it. Whilst the game at face value does operate like a strategy RPG, the enemies don't act like your typical SRPG enemies would. For example, they won't generally target your weakest characters or your healers. There are times where I've moved weaker characters to places where they would normally be decimated, but the enemies tended to attack whoever was closest to them, rather than being strategic. In a way, on some occasions this was a relief, as it would have been disappointing to lose partway into a dungeon and have to start from the beginning. Although on that topic, the game is fairer in that if you do die, you will only restart at the start of the battle you lost, rather than your last save. This time around, some of the battles have unique victory conditions, however most of them consist of killing all the enemies on the screen. I would have liked to have seen more protect this person, or escape the enemy type scenarios. In my previous review, I mentioned that I didn't like the broader character sprites in the first game. However, I actually like them a lot now. The graphics have been improved with more frames per animation, so character attacks, spells and counters are more vivid and detailed. I particularly liked how Shantae would angrily take off her heel to strike the enemy at the end of a critical attack, or how Choco would brush her teeth before falling asleep after being inflicted with the sleep status. CGI animations returned, and while still grainy and compressed, breathe life into some of the more dramatic scenes. However, these only encapsulate locations and vehicles, and mostly collapsing structures. Characters are never shown in a CGI cutscene. This is a little disappointing, but the game does a great job of capturing the emotion of the moment without having to use CGI to portray it. The various countries and locations all have their own unique design and flair, which reflect the native cultures. The area maps from the country selection screen are now topographical, and within the countries, you can move your character around to the different locations on an actual world map, rather than just a drawing with coloured areas, as was the case with the first game. Arc the Lad 2 borrows heavily from the music library of Arc the Lad, though there are additional tracks to round out the original score. Some of the new music really puts you in the mood, from the jazz themes of East Aldia to the industrial track of the slums of Romalia. My favourite themes are Battle 6 from the official soundtrack of the game, as well as the lyrical track Music Man, which you can only ever hear once when you see Shantae singing in the bar in Indigus. I always enjoyed arriving in a new place to hear the music. Also, the larger boss battle themes are all great, and put you in the mood to kick some ass. Overall, Arc the Lad 2 is a great improvement over the first game. It's clear that Sony Computer Entertainment Japan learned from their experience in creating the first game, and put their passion into expanding the capacity and capability of this one. Working Design's translation of the original Japanese script into English worked so well, breathing life into the characters and making them all unique and interesting. I am not sure why this game was not very popular in the West, and isn't really mentioned all that much these days. However, I am definitely an advocate. If you have not played this game, what are you waiting for? Drop everything you're doing and pick it up within the Arc the Lad collection for the original PlayStation, or on the PlayStation Network in NA or EU territories. I promise you won't regret it. By the way, are there any lesser known gems that you happen to love? As I mentioned, Arc the Lad 2 isn't that well known, and maybe it's because it was released overseas so late into the life of the original PlayStation. There are many other titles that also suffered this fate, and some that even were never released outside of Japan. I'd be interested to know what lesser known games you've enjoyed over the years. Please let me know in the comments. As always, thanks for watching and I hope to see you again soon.